Welcome back. This is part 5 of the Shuffle Retrospective. Feel free to check the others with the link in the icon above. Episode 18, A Welcome Break, The One Ring Loves. Episode 18 comes off on the surface as a break from the more emotionally charged episodes prior, even going so far as to go back to the old title card segment and having the more light-hearted ad break slot with the two cat plushies. And while in truth it definitely is more light-hearted to watch, there's still a lot going on under the bonnet which prevails throughout the whole episode, culminating in a long overdue slap at its close. Episodes 18 and 22 are the most fascinating episodes for me. Not my favourites by any means, but in some ways the most important. I was surprised with both episodes just how much I felt compelled to write on them in my notes. Keeping with our arc grouping system, True Feelings arc tree for our purposes is from episodes 17 to 21. Let's examine that a little further. Episode 17 is rather obvious, as the title of that episode concurs with us, and is about Sia plus Kikokyo accepting their true feelings and inner selves. Episode 19 is Keade and Osa realising their true feelings, but not wholly admitting to them. And episode 20 sees Primula admit her feelings 5 episodes after her arc concludes, with episode 21 having Keade come to terms with what she's already realised. So how, in this glorious narrative cohesion, does episode 18 fit in? Actually staring us right in the face. It's Rin's turn. Rin fascinates me as a harem protagonist. He's kind-hearted, sure, but that's about it. He's incredibly weak-willed in some regards, aware of his situation, yet often oblivious to the effects of his actions, sometimes inadvertently selfish, and has a faulty sense of altruism. Throughout episodes 18 to 21, we'll be addressing Shuffle's family unit a lot, that of Rin, Keade and Primula, as this is where Shuffle's deconstructive nature shines brightest. Shuffle is not a deconstructive or parody anime, but in its pursuit to gently show the flaws of its own and its contemporaries' fantasy narratives, it inadvertently manages to become one of the finest breakdowns the genre has available. As mentioned, from here on out, the show really brings home its more critical nature, and in just the opening minutes of episode 18, we get to see the start of this. In a short scene, we witness Rin apologising to Asa for the events of the prior episode. It's in their usual fashion, with Asa acting a little soon. The two bounce off one another in a fairly natural way, natural for anime at least. They're not quite flirting, but there's clearly a familiarity and chemistry between them. As this goes on, and just beforehand, we can overhear some nameless students in the background. One of them is attempting to confess to an equally unnamed boy, and while Rin and Asa banter in the foreground of the scene, we see the rigid confession scene in the background. It's a standard Japanese affair, with the girl asking the guy out via a bow. It's almost theatrical, with her friends hovering in the background. What all this suggests to me is the writer's intention is to show us how Rin and Asa's relationship is far more true to life than the idealised, polite idea of romance that we see in shoujo manga. Asa, in stark contrast to the young girl behind her, has no interest in bowing to Rin and asking his permission to go on a date. Instead, she pounced at his inconsideration for missing their appointment the day before. It's a simple visual, but it's a great way to start an episode in which we will see the tropes of anime and visual novels aren't generally the best way to approach a real-life romance, and it's the sort of visual play I can appreciate. Continuing on the episode's theme of light-hearted contrasts, we move on to the Operation Meeting scene. What I really love about this is if you've ever played a visual novel or been around the rom-com block a few times, this scene will be far too familiar, though One and Grizia is probably my favourite. With Sia and Narine now realising they've lost the battle, they team up with Itsuki and Mayubi in order to plan the ultimate date for Rin and Asa to go on. It's done like a military strategy meeting with projectors and maps and Itsuki as the general. It's amazing how simple yet effective this is, as the whole audience at this point has become fully aware that Itsuki is a complete idiot, who knows nothing about real relationships or how to treat women, and yet the trio of girls go along with his plan, eventually saluting him. It's played for laughs, and it is funny, but the undercurrent here should be clear to all, that a plan like this is doomed to only fail and hurt Asa's feelings. Rin almost realises this when he suggested that Asa might prefer the cinema. This is a clear sign that he has developed, and he even goes as far as saying, "What about what I want to do?" It's fantastic that this line is here, but let's say the scene comes across as a step back for Rin, as unfortunately he hasn't yet wholly developed. In the end, going along with the light peer pressure of his comrades, rather than sticking to what he wants to do, or what Asa would prefer. An interesting point of note is the framing of the scene. in how all the other worlds sit opposite Rin, so that the scene plays as Rin, suggesting a down-to-earth idea like the cinema, opposed by a demon, a god, and an imp. It's divided 50-50 and is another nice play of literary shorthand to show the fantastical, unrealistic nature of the girl's suggestion. I also like how Shuffle almost always stays logical. Keade and Primula aren't here because, of course, they aren't. There's no way in heck Keade could handle this conversation, and Primula doesn't yet attend their school. But it also suggests something about what the girls think of Keade. They naturally assume at this point that she'd not be interested in this conversation. After all, she should presumably be around somewhere, showing how they never even pass consideration over the ramifications of Rin dating Officer. In fact, while I praise the fact that Rin has gained some degree of self-awareness, he never mentions or factors in Keade. His hubris at this point is not in his not properly acknowledging her feelings, but at his ignorance. It also reminds us that to him, she's a sister, not a love interest, something that will become very important presently. Next up, we have some quickfire scenes that are worth addressing. We get to see Primula, Rin and Keade sitting in their living room, discussing Rin's impending date. As mentioned above, Rin sees no issue with this, as he doesn't take into account Kaide's feelings, which makes this scene just brilliant. Let's break it down literally, but also symbolically. Rin, sitting next to his surrogate daughter, who has conspicuously swapped back to her old attire, as if to hammer home the point that she's meant to be his kid, and his wife, brags excitedly about the date he's going on with his girlfriend. It's incredibly perverse, and I love it. Visually, we're looking at a young family having a nice discussion after dinner, when in reality, with a smile on her face, the wife figure talks about her husband's lover in front of their child. It's so wrong and borderline creepy, and yet it's taking place in what's meant to be the light-hearted episode. It's this subtlety that puts Shuffle on a pedestal for me. The more you think about scenes like this, the more you get from them. And did I mention there's no music? Yeah. No music, except for the heavily muffled TV in the background. The scene is literally helping to convey the disconnect between what the characters are saying and doing. This idea of the fantasy romance is being criticised more harshly here than anywhere else. Yet it's done, and not done in a flashy manner. At the scene's close, it's clear that only Primula understands the irony of the scene, which adds to the setup for her secondary arc that's coming. It should be noted she barely opens her mouth during the whole conversation, instead just making concerned expressions. Another quick scene is Asa picking her clothes for the date. It stands as a nice comparison to many of the other girls. Keade and Primula put fuck all effort into their clothes. Narane automatically dresses regally, and Rin has a seemingly endless supply of Yakuza suits, but it most contrasts the Sia date scenes. As mentioned before, the Komaku scene had a deeper point about how Sia sweats the small stuff. By comparison, Asa is far more flippant about it. That's not to say she doesn't think about it, she definitely does, but it feels more natural. She seems excited rather than worried or anxious. It helps hammer home the fact that she's the most real and healthy of the girls, ironic I know, and makes a nice change of what we've seen prior. Next we have the date proper. Straight off the bat, the show delivers another quick scene to further set the tone. At the gate to Cupid Land, Asa reaches out to take Rin's hand, but he's too distracted with the elaborate plan and walks on ahead. We've seen this half a dozen times throughout the show's run, and for the most part the reaction for the girl present is to swoon and look on at Rin wistfully, but here Asa defies this convention by looking thoroughly pissed off and then pouting. It's funny, a little tsundere, but more importantly, it establishes right away in a very subtle way that a date with Asa is going to be a marked departure from what we've seen so far. It also adds further to Rin's foolish ignorance towards the whole situation. This next scene, I've simply written in my notes, Jesus Crimbo, it's Attack of the Dawn CGI, oh god, no! This is a reference to the digitally rendered go-kart ride. It's thankfully the only instance of modern CGI in the whole show, which is a mercy, as generally I think Shuffle looks really great, but I'd be remiss not to mention this one minor slip-up in the art directions part. Also, as aforementioned, we get a change to the halfway card. This refers to the ad break bookmark, which before episode 12 is simply Primula's cap, plushies performing cute actions. And in the show's attempt to disarm the audience into thinking this is a throwaway episode, they dispense of the post-episode 12 card of the 5 girls pose naked, an obvious bit of symbolism to show they bare themselves mind and soul during their respective story arcs, and back to the cats. It's a nice touch as they do the same with the title card, going back to the less conspicuous green arrows. This won't be the last instance of messing with the title card, so keep that in mind if you're looking for Easter eggs during Keade's arc. We get another scene when Asa cancels Rin's plans and decides to take him on the boat trip. This expertly shows us how well she knows him, as she's already aware that Rin can't do roller coasters. In a way, this makes Rin mirror Sia's early attempt at a date in Arc 1, which we've already mentioned failed because of its unnatural pursuit of a perfect date, and Sia's pointless adherence to her game plan. All of this is to say that the audience should be subconsciously aware that what Rin's doing is going about it all the wrong way. That's the quick fire round through. Now we've got to the episode's most important scenes to look at. In keeping with things so far, they're not all that much longer, but make it clear to anyone who's what's going on, for those who haven't picked up on the myriad of context clues as to what this episode is really about. So after Rin continues to perform insensitivity across the course of the date, things come to a head when Asa confronts Rin on the day's activities. She calls out their group of stalkers, in usual anime fashion. Sia, Narane, Itsuki and Mayumi come to observe and interfere, and questions Rin on his intentions. Now is the time for Rin to apologise, to own up and make amends. But that isn't quite what he does. Instead, he does something quite insidious. He tries to insinuate that things got out of hand because of the other's plan, going as far as to essentially say that he didn't want to go on a date. We know, and I believe Asa knows, that this isn't really what he means. And the problem isn't what he says, but rather what he thinks. As Asa once more astutely points out, just as she did in episode 13, Rin has been peer pressured into doing what others think is best. He hasn't gone with his plan, or what he thinks she'd like. He goes as far as to say he wanted to do something similar. But as Asa states, if that's what he wanted, then he should have done it. This is supposedly, or essentially, the same conversation from episode 13, except in that episode, sending Primula back really did seem like the right idea at the time, and so Asa didn't lambast Rin, but instead supported him. But here, what we soon realise is, unlike then, now Rin has been a dickhead. He acted insensitively, despite knowing it was wrong to do so, and that, combined with the fact he's hurt her feelings, leads to a long overdue slap. Now, when I talked on episode 13, I praised how no one slapped Rin, and I stand by that for the reasons as mentioned there. But here the slap is so deserved, and even cathartic for the audience. It's a real credit to the show that it knows when and when not to slap someone, as had this happened in episode 13, then now it would have had far less weight behind it. Rin is spiralling towards his old ways and habits from pre-episode 15, and this is just the wake-up slap he needs. With a brilliant performance from Monica Rial and some great artwork, this scene is the second lynch point for Rin's character arc going forward. With some sense kicked into our trepidatious protagonist, he retreats home to recover, and even after all that's happened, the show isn't quite done. In what follows, Keade's arc officially kicks off, and what a way to start it. We see Rin enter the kitchen of their home, where Keade is just standing silently by the dinner table, food prepared. This scene always freaks me out, but there's some lovely clever filming tricks going on here too. For one, we get another use of the stationary, natural camera angle, showing the room which has always been drawn in order to narrow it at the far end. But with this new viewpoint, we get Keade greatly diminished in size, where Rin, standing by the room's door, looks larger, but furthermore, this helps to greatly increase the physical distance between them, even in a room this small. Next, as we're entering, we're continuing from Rin's perspective, which we've had all episode, and like we see, like him, we see a well-lit room, as, after all, the lights are on. But what follows takes a rather literally dark turn. After Rin rejects the food and goes to rest, we swap to Kaide's perspective as she trashes the food. I think this simple metaphor can work two ways. One, it's a comparison for how Rin has been throwing her aside without a word since pretty much episode 1. Secondly, it can act as a representation or even a signal to the audience that the last vestiges of her sanity and self-restraint have fallen away, that her unhealthy obsession with caring for someone finally takes a complete hold, and she transitions to true yandere mode, as it were. Also, note how dimly lit the shot is. Sure, it's the inside of a bin, but the room seemed markedly bright from Rin's perspective, so why is it so apparently dark now? This is all cleared in about 5 seconds of animation when we go to a top-down view of the room. You could easily be forgiven for missing this, but the image seems to be of Keade now standing in a dark kitchen. Except the lights are still on. The same lights as when Rin entered. Have I mentioned that this level of subtlety that I love so much? On the surface, what you're seeing is Keade staring silently into the dark, which is true, but in reality, you're seeing it from her perspective. Using a simple visual lighting trick, the show is communicating the light has literally drained from her life to the point that standing in a brightly lit room, she might as well be in pitch blackness. The reason the lights were on when Rin entered? Not because she hates the environment, but because she literally didn't notice they were on. The next shot confirms this with a close-up of Kaide's face. This isn't some stylistic choice. We can see lights still emitting from the very top of the screen, but her eyes have completely glazed over. All this conveyed in 3 shots that are 3 short still shots. The light has gone out of her light, fleeting, quite practically stage left. And so it begins. Listening. We're now roughly a little under halfway through our elongated journey. I hope you've enjoyed. This part's a little shorter as we go into or dive straight into the Keade arc in the next one. So I hope you look forward to that. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.